Morning, Gwen. Morning, Leanna. So nice to see you guys.
Hi, Anne.
It's been a while, Leanna. Holy cow.
Yeah, a year, I guess.
That's right, isn't it? Oh, this is so fun. This is great. How are you doing, Gwen?
Oh, I'm doing good. I think, did you get a haircut? You look great.
Yeah, I did. I went for the Megan Fairburn kind of attempt, only like trying to avoid the bowling ball look that are my chubby cheeks. But yeah, I just wanted it gone for summer. Just wanted it gone.
Yeah, it looks
So
great.
like I'm so self-conscious with the camera thing and being online about my hair. So I found in so many lectures, I was like, oh, my hair. I'm like, no, you're here to lecture. You're not here to do that. So
oh, can relate.
yes. Yours is getting beautifully curly. I think it looks really good.
It's the same thing though. It starts going all over the place and you're looking at yourself on the camera. And if you weren't on camera, you wouldn't notice or care because you would just be doing your thing. But
Exactly.
Everyone, I'm Sharon.
Hey Sharon, how's it going? Sorry.
Zoom person. Of course, I'm totally not sure what I'm doing, but anyway, I think it's recording, which is great. And I think Peter Adkins is our chair, correct? But I don't see him here yet. Oh, there are 3 people in the waiting room. Let me look. I'm gonna miss them all, and hopefully he's there.
Well, I'll mute and like let the people who are actually supposed to be doing this, but it's so great.
Okay.
To this, Leanna.
Okay, there's Peter. I think.
Hi, Anne. I just wanted to. I started to type a hello to you in the welcome during the welcome remarks, but it's so nice to see you again.
It's really nice to see you too. Thanks so much, Shiloh, for all the work that you're doing, and Sharon too. I mean, you're doing great too. This is wonderful. Hey, Alyson. Good morning. And hi, Peter. It's nice to see you. I was just saying that it's to Leanna. It's been about a year since I guess I've seen her and you too. But really appreciated you sending me that paper of yours from last year. That was great.
Good morning, Peter.
Yeah, I was muting myself. You'd think I'd got better at doing that. I was just saying, yeah, and likewise, good to see you. And yeah, it's nice to see people I haven't seen since last year's conference.
Hi, Peter. I'm the Zoom person.
Hi.
And you're the chair,
hi,
I know. So hi, nice to meet you. So I'm just going to let you run the meeting. And
Sure.
I'm supposed to be chat moderator. So anybody who needs to chat me, and I'm going to figure that out in a minute. Okay, but I'm going to let you run the meeting. Okay.
Okay, cool.
All right.
Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, if I'm going to recommend people, if they want to type questions in the chat box. So during the Q&A part, I guess feel free to jump in if there's questions to be posed to people. Have we got all of the speakers present? I can see Alyson and Leanna.
Can I ask one question? I see that, I think, Leanna, you sent a paper link in a direct message. Can everybody see that, or is it just me seeing that?
That was just to you. I can send
Okay.
it like right before I talk again, not to these people.
Okay. I just want to make sure that, because I'm, like I said, I'm chat moderator and I'm not really sure what I'm doing. So I want to make sure that everybody can see the messages. Okay. All right, I'll go ahead and mute myself and I'll let you take it over, Peter, and I'll just keep letting people into the room if they come, okay?
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sharon. And I can see we do have Mary present as well. So it looks like we have everyone, but I'm going to suggest waiting just 2 or 3 minutes just to allow people to maybe find the passcode if they're struggling to get into the room. Yeah, so we'll wait a few minutes before kicking things off. one question, maybe you'll know the answer to this, Sharon, is with presentations, are panelists just able to sort of launch into their own presentation, or they've sent them to you?
Wait, repeat that, Peter. I missed that. Say that again.
With PowerPoint presentations, are the panelists able to just launch into their slides, or have they emailed them to you?
No one has emailed me anything, so I
Okay.
would assume they're just going to share their screens with us then.
Okay.
Yeah, it looks like I have the ability to do that.
That's what I was going to ask. That's good. Okay. So I can see people are still trickling in, so let's wait just 2-3 minutes.
I'm trying to admit everybody still.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's useful to know, actually, because I think I'm chat moderator for a panel later. I didn't realize that was part of my responsibility.
Yes, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing.
Sharon, I always find the admit all button to be very useful.
Yes, that's what I've been doing. So I'm just watching it. So
I'm just noticing that my chat is disabled. I'm not sure if that's for anyone else.
Oh, yeah.
okay. All right, I will ask because I'm okay. Okay.
Well spotted.
I'm asking quickly. Okay.
Yeah, mine is also interesting.
Yes, mine is disabled too.
Okay. I'm texting Amy right now.
Sharon, my guess is that's not an intentional setting.
Right. I hope not. So I've just texted her. Okay. So she's just earlier said, I'm the Zoom host, so you can message me with questions, but if your chat is disabled, then you can't, right? So although
I would just enable it. Amy's chairing a panel at the moment.
okay.
But she's not going to be able to answer your
Okay.
text.
There's somebody else watching the chat though here. So how do I enable this?
If you go to your security settings.
Okay, that's asking a lot. Hang on a second. All right. I see security. Okay. Enable waiting room, allow participants to chat.
There you go.
Okay. Is that working now?
Yay.
Yes.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thanks for.
Thank you, Shiloh.
And if Amy's unhappy about it, you can blame me. It'll be okay.
Okay.
I'll take it. No, but I think it's meant to be enabled. So.
Okay. Thank you.
There you go. Thank you.
Okay, I think that maybe that's a good sign that we should kick things off. So yeah, hello, welcome everyone to the first panel, parallel panel of the conference. This is Things, Objects, Forms. So we have 3 speakers. We're going to run in the order that's printed on the program. What I think we'll do is I'll introduce each one before they give their paper, and then we'll have time for questions at the very end. As you probably gathered from the discourse that you probably just witnessed, we have enabled the chat box, and that is there for you to pose questions along the way. Sharon Joffe's going to be keeping an eye out, so don't worry if you type a question, it seems to disappear. They will be being collated and returned to during the Q&A part of the panel. And of course, you can also ask questions in the old-fashioned way of raising a digital hand and speaking aloud. So I think we'll kick things off with our first panelist, who is Alison Cook. Alison is a PhD candidate at the University of Saskatchewan, and her work focuses on a sustained study of feminist texts responding to global conflict in and beyond the interwar period. Her dissertation discusses how British, Irish, and Commonwealth authors place critical importance in their work on the material world to explore and critique the power structures through which patriarchal systems define subjects and objects, and which ultimately cultivates the circumstances that lead to war. So over to you, Alyson.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. I will just go ahead and share a access copy of my paper into the chat here. Right, so you should be able to see that. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you to my fellow panelists as well, Leanna and Mary. I'm really excited to listen to your talk after me, and also to the audience for coming to listen to us today. For technology's sake, because technology always seems to not work for me, I have opted against using a presentation. So hopefully you're all okay with just listening to me. So as my title suggests, I will be exploring today the appearance of vital matter in Woolf's short story, The Mark on the Wall, and how ultimately such a reading would lend a critique of the Great War. It is my argument that Woolf depicts the power structures through which patriarchal definitions of human subjects, of non-human objects, dominate the everyday operation of British society. Those definitions rest upon a hierarchical divide between subjects and objects, through which subjects use objects for specific and predetermined purposes. However, Woolf complicates this divide and reveals the difference between objects and things, between matter as it has a social function or significance, and things, which emerge, as Bill Brown notes, when the material dimensions of objects become evident and assert their presence and power, when they stop working for us. The female coded narrator in The Mark on the Wall experiences the thingness of the mark through her attempts to identify and define what she sees. The text suggests the ways in which the thingness of the mark operates in terms of its excessive state, which resists containment by established logic or language. This reveals in Woolf's work what Jane Bennett calls vital materialism, which allows for a repositioning of the human subject and a challenge to patriarchal and hierarchical thinking, as well as a move towards the centering of nature and a different understanding of experience. Through the perspective of her female narrator and through her internal monologue and thoughts, Woolf suggests a vision for a proto-eco-pacifist society and ultimately offers a judgment on war and violence as it stems from the former. Vital capability of matter, the result of which are things, reveal the different ways in which people are able to relate to the natural world, and the narrator of The Mark on the Wall demonstrates another way of being, where horizontal rather than vertical interactions are possible. While the ultimate removal of the mark by the narrator's male partner reveals how things are unable to really work within the patriarchal system, the disruptive potential of vital materialism that is recognized by the female narrator remains an alternative to the patriarchal institutions that rely on subject-object relationships. The interactions between human and non-human matter are marked by an event in which objects, items that have a specific and socially predetermined use, are misused or unusable in a traditional way. Brown's thing theory has become critical to my understanding of this interaction. To Brown, an object is determined in its utilization by a relation to a human subject. In contrast, Brown says that a thing arises from the object's changed relation to the human subject, and thus names less an object than a particular subject-object relation. For example, when the narrator in The Mark on the Wall observes the titular mark, it is the materiality of the object rather than its functionality that is revealed. The mark becomes a thing. It exists at the threshold between the nameable and unnameable, the figurable and unfigurable, the identifiable and unidentifiable. The narrator attempts to establish the meaning of the mark, but apart from a vague and basic description, she is unable to discern from where she sits what the mark is or how it was formed. Her attempt to do so demonstrates an initially conventional approach to understanding the material world that emphasizes the human subject centrality, a process that Brown describes as when we look through objects to see what they disclose about history, society, nature, or culture, above all, what they disclose about us. However, the mark resists objecthood, as indicated by the narrator's inability to identify it. Instead, the narrator ruminates over what the mark could be. And from these possibilities, the narrator explores different trains of thought according to aspects of British society, history, and culture. An example of this is when the narrator looks at the mark and discerns that it seems actually to project from the wall and resemble a small tumulus. Identifying the mark as a possible bump resembling a tumulus, the narrator then begins to ruminate on the barrows of the South Downs. She contemplates the recording of history, the individuals who undertake that recording, like the narrator's imagined retired colonel, and the accuracy of that recording. The narrator eventually returns to the mark, saying that she must jump up and see for myself what that mark on the wall really is. Only she does not get up, and she does not definitively determine what the mark is. Instead, she begins to wonder if the mark is an old nail and the social, historical, and cultural implications of that. This process, which continues throughout the narrative, demonstrates the thinghood of the mark as that quality is outlined by Brown. The thing seems to name the object just as it is even as it names something else. Crucial here, however, is Brown's observation that we begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us. In the eyes of the narrator, the mark does not work as the bump in the wall, just as it does not work as a nail or a hole or a rose leaf or as a crack in the wood. In its emergence as a thing, the narrator must consider the materiality of the mark rather than just its human-defined functionality. The mark's materiality resists the narrator's gaze while the narrator is willing to interact with its non-human possibilities. That the mark is what acts upon the narrator establishes the mark as the actant and therefore a source of what Bennett calls thing power. Bennett defines the actant as an operator, that which by virtue of its particular location in an assemblage and the fortuity of being in the right place at the right time makes the difference, makes things happen, becomes the decisive force catalyzing an event. The mark has an immediate and direct effect on the narrator in several ways. Though mentally exploring history, society, and culture, such as the narrator's exploration of the South Downs, the narrator never actually leaves the room. The mark is a force behind the assemblage it forms with the narrator. The mark is making things happen. It is an actant demonstrating what Bennett calls the curious ability of inanimate things to animate, to act, to produce effects, dramatic and subtle. It becomes both an anchor and an avenue for the narrator's thoughts and is the site from which the narrator's musings on British social norms are produced. In this assemblage, the narrator and the mark enter a reciprocal dynamic where a non-hierarchical collaboration between the two is established. The narrator and the non-hierarchical assemblage with the mark provides perspective in Woolf's texts for the evaluation of patriarchal imperial thinking. Leanna Lostoski-Ho similarly applies Bennett's theory of vital materialism to Woolf's texts, which considers the mutually impactful relation between human and non-human matter in Mrs. Dalloway and To the Lighthouse, where she points out that Woolf brings the non-human world to the forefront of her narratives. Likewise, in The Mark on the Wall, the mark is used by the narrator to undermine the authority of patriarchs, and together, the mark and the narrator become the vehicle by which Woolf offers an eco-pacifist approach to thinking. The barrows on the South Downs, in the narrator's musings, resist identification of either tombs or camps, and the process by which the imagined colonel attempts to label and objectify the landscape is proved inadequate when he can definitively do neither. The narrator does not attempt to seek empirical evidence of the South Downs, which would reinforce anthropocentric thinking that privileges human over non-human existence, but rather considers the question of the camps or tombs based on the way the South Downs makes her feel, similar to the way in which the mark itself makes her feel. Of the two, I should prefer them to be tombs, desiring melancholy like most English people, and finding it natural at the end of a walk to think of the bones stretched beneath the turf. Like the mark, which has preoccupied the narrator throughout, the South Downs need not be anything specific so long as the narrator is able to perceive the vitality of the landscape and its contained imaginative possibilities. That it is natural to think of the South Downs as tombs signals the narrator's understanding that humans are, like every other living thing, mortal, and therefore not superior to anything else. Furthermore, the narrator's observation that once a thing's done, no one ever knows how it happened, points to the ways history itself is recorded, the ways reality is approached, and suggests they are flawed. Her doubt prefigures Bennett's claims that it is important to open space for forms of ethical practice that do not rely upon the image of an intrinsically hierarchical order of things. Hierarchy in history is constructed by those who benefit from its construction, and it fosters empirical thinking that is imposed to organize material experiences from a human perspective. In opposition to this view, the narrator offers a different way of thinking when she creates an image of a pleasant world that decenters the human and underscores the importance of all matter. However, while the narrator is engaging with the mark in a relationship that allows it to act upon her and direct her thoughts, her partner quickly dismisses any use for the mark at all. I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. The partner replaces the thing back into its object position, an object that has no value to him in the house, and views the narrator and the mark as separate rather than perceiving them, as the narrator does, in formation with one another. Much like the imagined colonel who evaluates the South Downs, the partner evaluates the snail's place and regards the snail through an anthropocentric lens. Such dominance is deliberately linked by Woolf to patriarchal systems of thought. The declarations and statements of fact and of history can be seen in the narrator's partner and his references to newspapers, war, and objects. The narrator's thoughts oppose this mode of thinking and instead suggest that men fabricate stories despite their seemingly authoritative declarations. This opposition then ultimately calls into question the accuracy of the partner's final classification of the mark. Identifying the mark as a snail and thereby an object in need of a removal is not necessarily reliable, especially when, as a thing, the mark is able to engage with and act on the narrator in other ways. The story indicates that because they are based in restrictive categories and definitions of reality, patriarchal systems cannot account for complexity, for difference, and for non-human existence. It is the lack of complexity in patriarchal structures that connects with the text's critique of war, where conflict is generated by such reductive systems and the ideology they enforce. Bennett argues that the hierarchy of capitalist imperial economic structures rests on objectification, especially when powerful humans exploit illegal, poor, young, or otherwise weaker humans. As the narrator notes, everybody follows somebody, and the vertical formation between human and non-human matter encourages the exploitative behavior that leads to war, where the enemy is reduced to an objectification of evil that must be destroyed, and where the soldiers themselves are instrumentalized into violent tools for the conquests of the powerful men who benefit from a system of superiority. To conclude, the narrative's swift ending following the male partner's identification of the snail demonstrates the ways in which experiencing life in different ways is restricted by British society. These moments of vital materiality demonstrate the complex relations between subject, object, and thing that are present in Woolf's text, while simultaneously underscoring the limitation of the vibrancy of matter within a patriarchal society due to its eventual removal. My reading of this text highlights the possibility of incorporating eco-pacifism alongside the feminist analyses of Woolf's texts. After all, it is through her marginalized female character in The Mark on the Wall that Woolf undermines and critiques the patriarchal order according to their ability to recognize the ways in which things, like the mark, are confined and labeled within society. Ultimately, I am wondering how the narrator and other characters like her highlight the opportunity for alternative ways of experiencing the natural world, where horizontal, symbiotic relationships between human and non-human matter are possible, instead of vertical, hierarchical relationships of exploitation. I'd like to thank you for listening to me ramble on for the last 15 or so minutes, and I really look forward to talking to you after the rest of our presentations today. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alyson. That was a fantastic paper to kick things off. Okay, up next we have Leanna Lostoski-Ho. Leanna is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of New Hampshire. Her work focuses on representations of the environment, the passage of time, and humanity's relationship with the non-human world in early 20th century texts. She is currently working on her dissertation, in which she explores how ecological readings of modernist texts reveal environmental perspectives that can inform our response to the current climate crises. She has published an article on Virginia Woolf's depiction of non-human materialities, titled Imaginations of the Strangest Kind, the Vital Materialism of Virginia Woolf, 2016, which I think was cited in our last paper in the Journal of the Midwest Modern Language Association. And she'll have a forthcoming article in this year's Woolf Studies Annual about Woolf's rendering of deep temporality in the interludes of the waves. And her paper today is entitled Pointz Hall as Hyperobject, Woolf's Deep Geological History in Between the Acts.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, Peter. And thank you, Alison, for citing my paper. That is so exciting. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm going to share a link to my paper, and somebody start waving at me if you can't access it. And I'm also going to do a PowerPoint. So I will share my screen here and see if I can get that into presenter view. Okay, does that look okay to everybody? Yes, yes, okay, all right. Okay, so this paper today is titled Pointz Hall as Hyperobject, Woolf's Deep Geological History in Between the Acts. This is a little bit in an early stage of this project, so I'm definitely welcome to any suggestions or things that I could consider while I keep developing this. And for an overview today, I've got an intro about Woolf and geological history, going to talk about what I mean by hyperobjects, do some close reading of how Pointz Hall is shown through time in between the acts, and some concluding thoughts about the ethics of material geological histories. And, oh, well, let me go forward. There we go. Okay. So, Between the Acts is very much a novel about Englishness and the history of England. Written in the shadow of World War II, Woolf was increasingly concerned about the growing threat of the war, a war which she was unsure that the world could endure. Mark Hussey explains that in the late 1930s, Woolf was not alone in feeling greatly concerned about the future in the face of another war, as she and many others believed the, quote, way of life she had known and cherished was in imminent danger of disappearing. Her worries about war creep into her autobiographical writing in A Sketch of the Past, where she makes asides about German planes flying nightly over England and the fact that London has been bombed yet again. Woolf was writing Sketch at the same time she was writing Between the Acts. And in Sketch, she also expresses her conviction, quote, that by writing, I am doing what is far more necessary than anything else she could do in the face of the war. Her writing during this time is driven by the sense of purpose. And Between the Acts is her attempt to record English life as it was before it may change or be destroyed by an impending war. As many Woolf scholars have noted, however, Woolf's concern for recording life isn't contained merely to the human. Carol Cantrell, for instance, notes how Woolf details, quote, human history, geological process, the ongoing present life of the biosphere as parts of everyday life and experiences in between the acts. And Harriet Blodgett also writes that Woolf's inclusion of the natural and non-human in between the acts, quote, is a reassuring reminder that we are part of an enduring context. Between the Acts is therefore a novel brimming with the material world, as Woolf not only takes us into the inner turmoils of the lives of her human characters, but she also takes great care to bring the non-human world to the foreground. From the swallows, cows, wind, and rain that take their part in Miss Latrobe's pageant, to describing the land surrounding Pointz Hall as it has endured throughout history. This foregrounding of the material world in her narratives, as Elsa Hagberg has also argued, further speaks to what Woolf perceives as, quote, the threat posed by human technology between the world wars. In between the acts, Woolf does not simply write the setting of her novel, Pointz Hall, as an inanimate backdrop for her narrative. Rather, the space of Point Hall itself takes its part in the narrative, as well as the pageant performed on its lawn. Woolf describes and reframes the land around Pointz Hall, and even Europe itself, into a geological time frame to challenge us to rethink our understanding of history and our relationships to our environments, as well as just how entangled humanity is with the non-human world. I will argue for considering Pointz Hall as what Timothy Morton calls a hyperobject, or, quote, things that are massively distributed in time and space relative to humans. They further classify hyperobjects as having the potential to affect other materialities while not being immediately perceivable in their entirety because of their size. Therefore, hyperobjects do not experience the flow of time in the same way that human beings do. With Morton's hyperobject in mind, I will focus my analysis on specific spaces within Pointz Hall that Woolf describes in more detail throughout between the acts, such as the cesspool, the lily pond, and the outdoor stage of Miss Latrobe's pageant. In these spaces, Woolf's writing subverts anthropocentric conceptions of history by forcing her readers to confront the vastness of time and the relative ephemerality of humanity. Woolf's attentiveness to the materiality of Pointz Hall instead reveals a deep geological history in which humans are a mere part, in her decentering of the human from human history. And just a note about this comic, this is something I always like to share as a really nice representation of, how objects move through time in a much different scale than humanity does. A brief conversation to a rock is the entirety of human history and then some. So Timothy Morton in Hyperobjects, Philosophy and Ecology After the End of the World, writes about non-human objects that are so vast and imperceptible that they exist outside of human understandings of time and space. They identify these kinds of objects like a black hole, the Florida Everglades, the biosphere, or even long-lasting human-made products like styrofoam or plastic bags, or the sum of all the whirring machinery of capitalism, to name a few. Hyperobjects defy previous philosophical attempts at conceiving a thing in its entirety. Morton writes, because they so massively outscale us, hyperobjects have magnified this weirdness of things for our inspection. Things are themselves, but we can't point to them directly. Though their essential reality is inaccessible to us in their vastness of space and time, Morton explains that hyperobjects, quote, cause us to reflect on our very place on Earth and in the cosmos, so we must reconsider our understanding of what constitutes being. Morton's conception of hyperobjects therefore provides a useful framework for understanding the role the space and materiality of Pointz Hall itself plays in Woolf's representation of a deeper, more geological history beyond merely humanity's brief existence on this planet. Woolf demonstrates the challenge of trying to conceive of a thing in its entirety, as she shows how Lucy Swithin struggles, despite her concentrated attempts, to conceive of the entirety of English history while she's reading an outline of history. Woolf repeatedly references just how much of human history Pointz Hall has witnessed and endured. And we can think of Pointz Hall as a hyperobject in the role that it has played in shaping human history. So from the beginning of the novel, the land on which the pageant will be performed, the garden and lawn of Pointz Hall, is saturated with the richness of English history that it has witnessed, and what Louise Wessling has described as, quote, the landscape's embodiment of history from the era of the dinosaur through the Romans and up to the present, and the sustained natural rhythms of the land and its creatures, which will outlast all human effort. Woolf elevates her narrative to a vision of deep time in a single sentence when she describes the aerial view for the location of a nearby cesspool. From an aeroplane, you could still see, plainly marked, the scars made by the Britons, by the Romans, by the Elizabethan manor house, and by the plow when they plowed the hill to grow wheat in the Napoleonic Wars. The land has endured through various peoples and empires that have shaped it for their own use, and the land is what remains after the various chapters of English history tied to that land have drawn to a close. Woolf's depiction of land across time draws attention to the longevity of its existence and simultaneously exposes the relative brevity of human existence in comparison with these geological temporalities. It is impossible to conceive of all that the land has experienced, despite Woolf's sweeping efforts. The lily pool at Pointz Hall is also described in the temporal framework of geological deep time. Quote, there has always been lilies there, self-sown from wind-dropped seed. Water for hundreds of years had silted down into the hollow and lay there 4 or 5 feet deep over a black cushion of mud. Woolf emphasizes the agency of lily plants and the wind to scatter seeds, while noting the longevity of the lilies themselves, perhaps suggesting that they had been residents of the land surrounding Pointz Hall longer than humans had lived there. She further describes the water in the mud as being hundreds of years old, which places the water in the mud, in addition to the lily pond, as a whole ecosystem beyond the bounds of human temporality. The lily pool is thus rendered within a geological time frame, having existed long before humans and escaping total understanding and in its existence in a geological temporality. The subsequent story of the lady who drowned herself in the lily pool and whose body was never found further separates human and geological conceptions of time. The lost body of the lady who drowned herself in the lily pool has been absorbed by the ecosystem of the lily pool, acting as a source of nutrients and life in its decomposition. Although her life has ended, Woolf demonstrates through the lady's death how human temporalities and all of human history seems fleeting relative to geological temporalities. The pageant produced by Miss Latrobe attempts to render the history of England in a few hours, and it is staged on the lawn of Pointz Hall, a space Miss Latrobe deems to be, quote, the very place for a pageant. The space on the lawn, designated to be the natural stage of the pageant, turns out to be as integral to the performance as the actors and dialogue, as Miss Latrobe's pageant highlights the role of nature and the non-human across human history through their roles within the pageant. The trees, bushes, breeze, and animals that appear throughout the acts all have such a commanding presence in the pageant that it's difficult to overlook the extent to which Woolf draws attention to the non-human during the pageant. And however, the non-human in between the acts is not always as facilitating as Miss Latrobe would like it to be. The breeze often interjects itself into the dialogue and the lyrics of the actors in the pageant, and subsequently makes it difficult for the audience to try to glean meaning from the obscured and fragmented songs. This happens several times throughout the pageant, an example of which I've presented on this slide. And the breeze interjections do not leave the message and meaning of the play unscathed. As, quote, the breeze blew gaps between their words, the actors struggled to sing loudly enough over the breeze, despite Miss Latrobe's angry cries for them to sing louder. The breeze's interjection eventually renders the song impossible to hear or understand. In a way, it seems that the breeze and the rustling leaves assert themselves into this song about human history to represent the role of the non-human in history as well. Woolf describes the non-human voice in this pageant to undermine an anthropocentric view of history perpetuated by such songs that only detail humans and their actions. Her view of history, as well as time itself, is not confined to only a human history or a human experience of the passage of time. Woolf perhaps most poignantly weaves together time, the human and the non-human near the end of Miss Latrobe's pageant. In the final act titled The Present Time, Ourselves, Miss Latrobe has written in her script to, quote, try 10 minutes of present time, swallows, cows, etc., with the goal, quote, to expose the audience, quote, with present time reality. Miss Latrobe's vision of the pageant clearly accounts for the role of the non-human in a representation of the present time and human history. And as she has written, the swallows and cows who have already participated in the pageant before this point directly into the script. She believes the audience will see the materiality of the lawn around them if they are forced to stare at a stage absent of actors for 10 minutes. Unfortunately, the audience is confused by the lack of actors and actresses on the stage at the beginning of the final act, as they are not accustomed to truly considering the non-human and the material. The audience lack of recognition of Miss Latrobe's efforts to expose them to present time reality greatly distresses her. She begins to think that her illusion has failed when a sudden rain shower begins to fall on the audience. The bursting of the rain clouds in a sudden shower provides meaning for the audience struggling to comprehend what Miss Latrobe is trying to represent by forcing them to stare at their surroundings. Miss Latrobe is relieved by nature's intervention. "Oh, that's done it," sighed Miss Latrobe. Nature once more had taken her part. The risk she had run acting in the open air was justified. She recognized that nature has a role to play in her pageant, as she is grateful for its timely intervention. She does not assign any metaphorical significance for the rain, but she simply acknowledges that the non-human has come to her aid when she has failed to show the audience the materiality of their surroundings and how the non-human should be included in a rendering of a history on her own. As Woolf writes, the non-human and the material take their part in the staging of the pageant at Pointz Hall, as much as they have existed and taken its part in the shaping of the geological history of the Earth. So some concluding thoughts. Thinking about Pointz Hall as a hyperobject, one which has and will endure through history longer than humanity, is an inherently ethical act in its inclusion of the non-human world. Woolf's project in between the acts thus mirrors that of Miss Latrobe with her pageant, as both authors encourage their audiences to consider themselves in the present moment as a part of the entire history of England represented in her pageant. This radical consideration of the present moment and all it encompasses, the human actors as well as the very stage itself, is necessary if we are to ever truly care for all life and matter on this planet in the way it deserves. As Woolf writes, both the non-human and the material take their part in the staging of the pageant at Pointz Hall, just as they have existed in taking their part in shaping the geological history of the Earth. She ultimately challenges us in between the acts to expand our understanding of being, materiality, and temporality, to try and conceive the inconceivable, the entire geological history of England, so that the world may understand the ephemeral place of the human within a geological history across deep time. Thank you very much.
Wonderful, thank you, Leanna. It was another fantastic, really rich paper. Okay, great. Well, we'll move on to our final panelist, who is Mary Wang. Mary is a PhD candidate at National Taiwan Normal University. Her research interests include modernism, Virginia Woolf studies, and comparative literature. Recently, she has finished her dissertation, Sensations, Senses, and the More Than Human, Virginia Woolf's Ethical Aesthetics, which explores the egalitarianism of Woolf's modernist aesthetics. And Mary's paper today is entitled, He Was of the Rare Order of Objects, Woolf's Ethical Form and Ethical Affinity in Flush. So over to you, Mary.
Okay, thanks, Peter, for your introduction. And thanks for Leanna and Alyson's presentation. They are truly inspiring. And I have posted the quotation of my paper, and I'm going to present in PowerPoint. Okay. Okay, Virginia Woolf's Flush shows her pursuit of the notion of the unity, while paying attention to individuality, especially for those who are vulnerable, through her modernist strategy of the ethical form. Woolf, in this form, replaces the human protagonist with a non-human dog Flush, breaking the boundary between humans and non-humans. Also, this form puts the issue of biography and history into question, offering us a lens of a dog to understand the world as Woolf celebrates all others and those who are debased and devalued by humans. Importantly, this novel is preoccupied with flesh smells, leading us to see how a non-human's sensations and senses as an actant to break the boundaries and then enable humans and non-humans to unite as a remarkable couple. A relationship of mutual trust, understanding, and empathy for each other as a kind of Woolf's concept of community. Flush includes Woolf's care and concern for the vulnerable, from the humans to the animals, the healthy to the invalid, and the rich to the poor. In this way, Woolf displays multiple voices, perspectives, and sensory experiences to destabilize the unitary discourse. One thing we have to bear in mind is that Flush, like Orlando, is a form of the fictional biography, putting the unitary notion of history and the biography into question. As the modernist features experimental form and content, in response to the chaotic social background, Woolf's Flush is a form referring not only to aesthetics, but ethics. At this point, how does Woolf apply her form to destabilize and move beyond the legacy of history in the writing of biography? How does Woolf use this form to play with and subvert the historical and social reality? And how does Woolf speak for the marginalized? Raymond Williams argued that the notion of form contains two major senses. The first refers to a visible or outward shape, and the second refers to an inherent shaping impulse. That is, the former refers to the external shape in which some specific rules, such as genre and rhetoric, are formulated into literature. However, the latter refers to the inner driving forces that form the form. The concept of form, quote, ranges from the external and superficial to the essential and determined. Notwithstanding, Williams does not merely distinguish these two senses of form. He also emphasizes the interactive and the dialectical process between these two senses. Williams further discusses the notion of form in the social context, claiming that form is a social product and the product of form is a product of the relation between social collective modes and individual projects. Form is constituted by a consistent negotiation between community and the individual. In the process of shaping form, a communicative force between the collective and the individual acts out, rendering form unfixed, unstable, and dynamic. Form contains instability in which the social, historical, and the cultural stereotypes can be destabilized. It includes volatilities, and the use of form enable us to deconstruct and rearrange the authoritative discourse. Form opens a space for the public and the private to negotiate. Creating an imaginary biography of Elizabeth Browning's dog Flush, Woolf uses her modernist form to deconstruct the notion of historical writing. Flush shows us how a form not only destabilizes history and the truth, but gives its voice to the marginalized. In response to the women who are oppressed by nationalism and the patriarchy in her time, Woolf uses Flush as a form to denounce violence. Notably, writing a biography is associated with ethical and philosophical issues, such as what is history, who oversees history writing, what is truth trustworthy? Given that Flush is not a regular biography written by received ideas, this novel can be regarded as a form to define social norms and give an ethical space for those minorities. In The Art of Biography, Woolf argues quote, he, that is the biographer, must be prepared to admit contradictory versions of the same face. The biography will enlarge its scope by handing up looking glasses at odd corners. And yet, from all the diversity, it will bring out not a red of confusion, but a rich unity. This shows Woolf's expectation toward biographers, as she hopes biographies will not fall into the mar of historiography. In this way, Woolf in Flush spreads awareness of the concern for the marginalized to model the male-centric form of biography, because the vulnerable Elizabeth Browning and the non-human Flush are the protagonists. Woolf's biographical writing no longer serves the male-centric tradition, but sketches or even stages the vulnerable. Woolf undoes the male-dominated paradigm and attends to the vulnerable and the unnameable. Woolf plays with the idea of form. At the beginning of the novel, Woolf deliberately imitates the form of a historical novel to trace back Flush's ancestry along with the legend. Quote, the Spaniel family was a family distinguished and apart. There was an aristocracy of dogs while the Queen Elizabeth was on the throne. Woolf satirizes the hierarchical system as she points out the criterion for the categorization of the dogs is much more reasonable than that of in the human world, because in human society, quote, the judges merely refer us to our coats of arms. As she strives to deprivilege the status of humans, Woolf does not consider humans superior to animals. In Flush, the dogs are sorted by biological characteristics, but in human society, people are often divided by socioeconomic status. Woolf criticizes this in the human world because this is somewhat determined by the anthropocentric standard. Woolf intends to blur the human-animal distinction and rebukes the social system. After talking about the criterion of the classification of the dogs, Woolf again criticizes human being with a sarcastic tone. As she points out, humans cannot be classified easily as dogs. Humans, as well as the society where they are nurtured, are far more complicated than dogs. Dogs can be divided by their physical features, but humans cannot, as quote, his, that is Dr. Mitford's eyes were light, his ears were curled, he was utterly selfish, recklessly extravagant, worldly insincere, and addicted to gambling, but he was a human being. Moreover, Flush is a novel of smells, as it's filled with Woolf's descriptions of Flush smells. Filled with the sketch of smells, Flush exhibits the fundamental divergence between the species of humans and the animals, as the human use language to communicate, but the animals use senses to navigate the world. It's a novel about smell and the assemblage of vulnerability of those who fail to fit into the nationalist agenda of modernity, the poor, the invalid, and the non-humans. With Flush's smellscape of the cities where he has smelled and sniffed, Woolf shows us how a non-human encounters a human being and lives together with prosperity. Smells play an important role in Flush. They allow us to stand in the shoes of an animal to know the world. According to David Breton, compared with the other senses, for example, vision, in the Western tradition has been thought of as the quote, most intellectual of the senses. Smell is frequently devalued and discriminated against as it's, quote, limited to receiving impressions without reflections, associated directly with the animal's way of perceiving the world. However, as Flush navigates, explores, and experiences the world through his olfactory senses, we can notice Flush smell can be associated with feelings and emotions, similar to the cognitive system of human beings. His smell can be connected to the activities of the mind, as opposed to the widespread belief of dualisms entrenched in the Western tradition. Woolf describes Flush's sense of smell after Flush takes a walk with Miss Mitford when he feels, quote, an even excessive appreciation of human emotions. Quote, what a variety of smells interwoven in subtlest combination thrilled in his nostrils, strong smells of earth, sweet smells of flowers, namely smells of leaf and bramble, sour smells as they cross the world, pungent smells as they entered bean field, a smell that read across his brain stirring 1,000 instincts. He forgot his mysteries, he forgot humankind. In this case, flush reverses the natural order of cognitive development from the first stage of senses to the final stage of acquiring knowledge or feeling emotions. Through his sense of smell, Flush draws himself back from the human emotions to his, quote, strange emotions of sexual instincts. Flush in this process is gradually becoming a human. Yet when Flush gets outside to walk and immerse himself in nature, his animality is summed up. Through the sense of smell, Flush returns to an animal again. Besides, by demonstrating Flush's smellscape of the world, Woolf forges connections with the subjects and the objects. No matter whether they are humans or non-humans, the animates or the inanimates, they are put as equal without hierarchy. Quote, for Flush, mixing with the smell of food were further smells, smell of cedar wood and sandalwood and mahogany, scents of male bodies and female bodies, of men servants and maid servants, of coats and trousers, of crinoline and mantles, of curtains of tapestry, of curtains of plush, of coal dust and fog, of wine and cigars. Through showing Flush's senses, Woolf dissolves the boundary of the pre-existing categories and weave them together, because for the non-human Flush, the sensations for everything are merely his sensual organs' reactions without carrying cultural meanings. Woolf's ethical attitude toward animals shares similarity with Deleuze and Guattari's philosophy, as she dissolves boundary and attends to one's entanglement with the others. Woolf pays attention to ethical affinity and the companionship of Flush and Elizabeth Browning because of their shared vulnerability. Quote, Leah was a likeness between them. Flush is a non-human animal, and Browning is a woman and an invalid. Both could be treated as marginalized in mainstream society. As an animal, Flush relies more on his sensations and senses. His smell leads him to explore the world and even sense the emotions of the human. In this way, Flush and the Browning can understand each other, though they are different species. For example, when Miss Barrett is in love with Mr. Browning, Flush is hostile to him and smells that, quote, the whole room reeks of Mr. Browning's presence. His, that is Flush's vanity, was exacerbated. His jealousy was inflamed, and his feeling overcame him. He flung himself on Mr. Browning and beat him savagely. Here, Flush sensations correspond with human emotions, which are not merely sensual organs reactions, but are with meanings. In addition to Flush smell, 2 points demands analysis. One is Flush suffering in Whitechapel, in which we can find out Woolf's concern for the female and the marginalized. The other is Browning's expatriate experience in Italy, from which Woolf intends to criticize in her society. First, as Woolf depicts, though it is, quote, the apparent solidity and the security of Wimpole Street, there are areas behind Wimpole Street, quote, in which human beings lived herded together above herds of cows. And the poverty and the vice and the misery had bred and the seed and propagated. This passage once again blurs the distinction between the human and the animal, because the sordid living condition of the poor render the human and the animal indistinguishable. Human beings are similar to the living animals that fight for a living under these circumstances. On the other hand, this description shows Woolf's ethical concern for the marginalized. Woolf in Flush attends to the area outside Wimpole Street, where people live in poverty and have a distinct life from Browning and Flush. Woolf deliberately uses many descriptions to manifest its otherness of the area of Whitechapel. Woolf employs an ethical form to speak for the marginalized, particularly for the invalid and the non-human animal. Demonstrating flash sensations and senses, Woolf blurs the boundary between the human and the non-human, and she undertakes to ally the marginalized. Vulnerability, as Judith Butler claims, quote, is enhanced by assembling. It allows to assemble the voices and the forces coming from the vulnerable in defiance of the oppressor. Paying heed to the flash sensations and senses, Woolf evinces respect for the objects and the vulnerable. Flash smell offer possibilities to travel and traverse beyond the boundaries. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Mary. That was, yeah, another really rich, fascinating, detailed paper. So thank you. We have plenty of time for questions, but what I'm going to suggest we do is maybe take a couple of minutes just to give our brains a rest and reflect. So maybe at 12:30. We'll come back and we'll kick questions off, but that should give people enough time to maybe fill up water bottles or make a quick cup of tea. So yeah, I will pick things back up at 12:30. Okay, I make that 12:30. So if the panelists are able to, okay, it looks like Alison, Mary back. Okay, and there's Leanna as well. So yeah, let's open things up to questions. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'm not going to take the chair's privilege. If there's other people who want to ask a question, either by typing it in the chat box or raising hand. Okay, so we have one hand raised. Gwen, you have your hand raised.
This question is for Alyson and or Leanna. I'm thinking of Alyson's presentation and a discussion of Woolf's writing about war. In the mark on the wall, it's during the First World War. And then Leanna, is talking about Between the Acts and the sort of eve of the Second World War. When you discuss eco-passivism in your work, Alyson, do you see this sort of, how or where do you see this sort of showing up in Woolf's later work, beyond the obvious of Three Guineas? It's a bit of a vague question, but do you think that there's a sort of thread from the mark forward to say, like, her work in the late 1930s and so on?
Great question, Gwen. Thank you. Definitely seeing this kind of eco-pacifism later in her later writing. I haven't read Between the Acts in quite a while, since my undergrad, but Leanna talking about it really made me start thinking about eco-pacifism in her later works, and how the environment really plays a part throughout Woolf's writing, and especially when she starts to consider an alternative to war, and how environment can really take a prominent position doing that. I'm not sure if that answers your very vague question. That's kind of a vague answer to your vague question. But I don't want to, if Leanna wants to pipe in here, that'd be great.
Yeah, thank you, Gwen, and thank you, Alyson. Gwen, I think that's a fantastic question, and I haven't read A Mark on the Wall, so that is a really great observation that we've got this like large span of how Woolf is thinking about war. And I loved, Alyson, your articulation of eco-pacifism. That was really exciting to me. So I think I maybe lost the thread of the question in my excitement of all these observations. But yeah, I don't know. There's certainly like, I think you can probably trace her development of how she's thinking about war and pacifism, and certainly drawing this attention to how much the material is showing up in these works. Like, it's hard to deny that there's not some environmental aspect to pacifism as well, or that she's kind of raising the bar of what's at stake. It's not just human lives and civilization, but really everything with these wars. But yeah, fantastic observation and question. Thank you.
Thank you both.
Okay, Ellen, you have your hand raised.
Yes, I'll jump off it. Everything is at stake. I too haven't read Between the Acts in a while, and so I have both a comment and a question. As you were talking, of course, I thought about Ukraine right now and the bombs dropping on us right now. And someone mentioned the piece that Virginia Woolf wrote, where she's laying in bed and she hears the planes coming over. And I was wondering how much in the work, Between the Acts, are we aware the bombs falling down? Because not only is the war going to destroy all the human-made objects, when you dump landmines, when you dump all this hideous, destructive stuff into the land, it can change it permanently. So I was wondering how much actually in the work does she actually suggest this, or is it that while everybody is watching the pageant, they think of it? And the third one is, I have no right to ask, but I believe that E.M. Forster wrote a pageant, and I'm wondering if his pageant is similar to Virginia Woolf's, because it also was a pageant written during World War II. So those are my comments. Anybody want to respond to them?
Yeah, thank you, Ellen. I am not aware of the Forrester pageant, so if anyone wants to speak to that, that would be awesome. But I just reread Between the Acts yesterday, so I can say that what struck me reading it again was that at the very end of the pageant, we have the priest comes up on the stage and is kind of pontificating about what does this pageant all mean? And then all of these warplanes just fly over in a very dramatic fashion. And he has to like stop his speech and wait for them to pass. So it's like, it's kind of like haunting the narrative, I guess you can say, and kind of that's a very threatening moment of kind of destruction with these planes coming over. But other than that, she doesn't like directly write about the destruction, but I think you can see her concerns kind of bleeding through there.
Just to
Very good paper, very good paper.
Thank you.
Just to come in on the Ian Forster point, I haven't read the Ian Forster's pageant either, but there is a book by Jed SD called A Shrinking Island, where he compares between the acts to Forster's pageant in a really fascinating way. So that's a recommendation. Other questions? Christina.
Hi, thanks everyone for those papers. I really enjoyed them. And I just thought I would maybe follow on the point that Gwen raised and bring in Mary, your paper on Flush. And even though Flush is a text that's set in, the Victorian era, it's also very much written out of the 1930s and in response to kind of fear of the rise of fascism and so on. And so I wondered if when you were thinking about marginality and so on, and sort of the power dynamics in Flush, was the moment in which the book was written and that political context behind it, was that also in your head, and did that maybe also speak to the question of kind of the sense of war looming and so on, just to tie all three papers together?
Okay, I didn't think about the historical context in Flush, but when I read several of the books, Woolf's novel, the first thing I mentioned is that Woolf particularly pays attention to the senses, like the audio, visual, and the smells, and I think it's have meanings. So I think we can know the works that in Woolf's late times, like Between the Acts, she starts to care about the plants, animals, and the nature and something. So I think maybe they have some connections, even if Flush, the historical background of Flush is set in the Victorian age. Maybe it's kind of her reflection, I guess. But I didn't think about this much. Maybe I will think it further.
I was just thinking about what you were describing in Flesh reminded me of In Three Guineas, which is a text that's responding to the sort of political moment of the time and the way in which the treatment of animals is seen as sort of in a continuum with war and so on. And so, yeah, those just seem to really resonate across from the 30s to the Victorian period in a really nice way. So yeah, thanks everyone for the talks.
We have a question from Kelly.
Thank you, everyone. Wow, what a great panel to attend. I've really enjoyed it. And I guess my question does spur from how you see Woolf, and I love the way in which, Leanne, that idea of all of the mirrors then that we have at the end of Between the Acts paired really well, Mary, with your quote in terms of the biography, right, should hold mirrors up at different corners to expose, the full thing. And one of the questions that came to mind. I was listening to your papers, and good papers always inspire questions, make you think differently than you did before, which is why I love attending conferences. Is that idea of what aspects of these novels are showing us both the positive and negative potential of materiality, of thinking of these crossing boundaries of animals, etc. And one of the moments in between the acts, which I've wrestled with and always sort of had a difficulty understanding, is this idea of the view. And I will say, Leanne, too, I loved the explanation of the lily pond. That was so useful. But there are these moments where everyone just looks at the view. And I'm not sure what that place at Pointz Hall is doing. I mean, is that a kind of diminutive sort of pastoral rather than a complex pastoral that does something that she's critiquing about how we think about nature? Is that, I'm just curious as to what, if you've thought about those views and what they do, and that might actually, Alyson, relate to these ideas between object and being as well. Like when we call something a view, what does that do, the view, in terms of object versus being? And then Mary, I was also interested in an oppositional moment in Flush where he smells. Smell is law, smell is love, smell is religion or politics. And you don't need to know the particular quote I'm speaking of. I don't expect you to have the book memorized, but I was just curious if you found any parts of the book too where you were like, well, wait a minute, is that a kind of human-centered use of smell rather than one that creates this sense of vulnerability? Like, did you find competing uses of smell that she might be using to critique what Elizabeth understands or doesn't understand about Flush, etc.? But I'm interested in these moments where Woolf seems to be using something both positively and negatively. And so that's a long introduction to give you guys some ideas to see if you could give me insight into that.
Well, I really liked your comment on the view. That made me really think of how in The Mark on the Wall, the narrator is actually sitting in a room looking at the mark. And that makes me think also of what an audience is doing in a play, which is sitting and watching the play. And that makes me think a lot about the use of like assemblages and actants, which I brushed on in my presentation, of like who is doing the action, what is the thing making things happen. And I think that's where we come in and thinking of the view of like, where is the action coming from? And drawing connections between audience and having the play act on the audience. And then in The Mark on the Wall, the mark acting on the narrator. So I don't know if that kind of good segue into maybe other points here, but that's what I was thinking. Thank you for bringing up that point though. That's really a new way of thinking of positions within texts.
Yeah, I like that a lot, Alyson, if I may jump in. And because I think there's something like unsettling about those moments with the views where the audience is just staring and they don't really know what to do or what to look at because they're not seeing the actors on the stage. And so I think, I don't know if there's in that moment the potential for like really looking at what is in front of them for the audience, but then also the negative potential of getting too uncomfortable and pushing it away. And, you know, we would be in this day and age looking down at our phones, you know, turning away from that discomfort and from really looking at our surroundings and just looking for that dopamine hit in our little devices. So that's kind of an interesting nugget to think about the difference between now and then. But yeah, that's a very thought-provoking question to bring up the view. And I, of course, would want to tag Shiloh to think about the pastoral, but I don't think I have any thoughts about that at the moment, but that would be really good to dive into that. And but that's a great question, and that's all I've got, but thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. I like your idea of the possibility and then the negativities. And I think maybe what you mentioned about the possibility and the negativity, I maybe it struck me like maybe the smells of the flush is its materiality have such a potential to model the dualisms of the human and non-humans. That is what I'm thinking about.
Thank you so much.
We have a question from Shiloh.
So, yeah, restraining myself from wanting to talk about pastoral, but if you want to hear about pastoral, you can come to our panel tomorrow, Time and Tide, Form and Fold. Gwen, I just wanted to also say that if you're tracking something like eco-pacifism, Alyson, and across Woolf, one place you also might look at is something like Three Guineas, where Woolf sort of particularly locates a love of nature as driving a kind of national sentiment and patriotism that makes one want war in some ways, and yet then has to pause and interrogate that impulse. So I think as you're working on a project of eco-pacifism, it would be really interesting to think about the doubled impulse that the idea of nature creates for Woolf. And I think you can sort of track that across her writing. And I think it's really interesting to think about what work that impulse or that attentiveness is also doing in A Mark on the Wall. Eret Telviste is here. Eret, you're here, right? Eret has an article coming out in the Virginia Woolf Miscellany in issue number 99 about Woolf and Estonian writer Leda Kibovitz that specifically deals with this love of place, nationalism, and sort of the anti-patriarchal impulse. So that's another place that you might want to look at, or the two of you might want to be in conversation. And then lastly, I have a question about view and it's for you, Leanna, in particular, because I'm really interested in what you're doing with Tim Morton's Hyperobject and thinking about Pointz Hall, which I immediately think of like the country house, but you really think it's the country house in the larger estate that is the hyperobject, right, of Between the Acts and its relation to the human. But Tim Morton also says that species, the human species, has become such a massively distributed entity that it itself is a hyperobject. And so I'm wondering if the mirrors and this question that's been asked about the view might do something to help you sort of think about the relationship between species as a hyperobject and the human in Between the Acts. And there might be something ethical about that reflective capacity that mediates between the species and the human. Species as hyperobject. I don't know what you want to do with that, but I thought, yeah.
No, thank you. I'm a little rusty on my Morton, so I need to go back to them, but I think I will just take that for now and look into it more. I don't know if I have much to say, but it excites me to maybe think more about the mirrors and how we could talk about that too. So thank you.
I'm going to take the chair's privilege now, having been very disciplined earlier and not having invoked it, to ask a question about animals. I suppose I'm going to try and frame this in such a way that sort of addresses all three papers without it being too scattergun, which is to do with how each paper was understanding animals. It struck me, Alyson, that when you're describing thing theory, the irony of, I guess, A Mark on the Wall is in some respects, it's not a thing, it's not an object, it's a subject, it's an animal, you know, it's a snail, and where thing theory perhaps might offer us a way, if you think thing theory offers us a different way of understanding animals. Similarly with Leanna, the hyperobject, and I'm thinking here about the presence of the swallows, the cows, the snake and toad as maybe a kind of assemblage. Does the hyperobject fit as a way of understanding the animals as well as the environment in which those animals feature? And for Mary, thinking again about how Woolf's understanding animals is there, how is she engaging with that sort of Victorian idea or Darwinian idea of species? And is this part of her, you know, sort of satiric approach to the biographical form? Is this also a satire on species as a category? So I don't know who wants to tackle that first. None of you.
I'll go first.
Okay.
That's a really great point, Peter. Thank you. Yeah, the fact that, well, not really the fact, because I personally don't believe that the mark is a snail, but that the male-coded partner identifies the mark as a snail is very interesting, yes, because it is an animal and therefore should be a subject. And yet the partner still treats it as an object and objectifies it anyways, saying that it needs to be removed and put back into its defined place, which is outside in the garden. And so I feel that also that the narrative's quick ending after this identification signals that also the narrator, even though she does admit like, yes, the mark on the wall, it is a snail, maybe opens up possibilities of now I'm losing my train of thought. It started so strong and now it's dwindling out.
You're doing good. Yeah, no,
thank you.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah, I'm thinking of ways of forms and structure and limitations, and how even thinking largely of the text itself, the limitations of the story and how it's ending when the partner identifies the mark, and how that also, yeah, that's where I'm going with this. And I will see where it goes eventually when I have time to think about it more. But thank you for that great comment and question, because it definitely makes me thinking a little bit differently about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, that is a very good question. And I think where it's leading me at this point in terms of thinking about the hyperobject in a way of understanding animals, I don't have an answer to that question specifically, but it makes me kind of think of the thing theory that Alison brought up, and in object-oriented ontology, how what is it? It's like the true nature of the thing is always just out of our grasp. We can never really perceive of something else in its entirety. And that makes me think of Lucy Swithin in Between the Acts. She's like trying so hard to imagine like, oh, what was England like with these like mastodons and like Piccadilly and the rhododendrons everywhere. And she really struggles, and everyone kind of brushes her off when she's rambling about the swallows and their migrations. But she's like really trying to conceive of like, how did these animals, like, how do they do this? How do they migrate here from Africa that's so far? And nobody else in the novel really wants to like think about it, but Woolf is showing us this example of someone trying but being dismissed for her trying. And I don't really know what to make of that, but it seems like Lucy's trying to get at these questions a little bit about how we can't really fully understand, you know, the non-human or an object or a thing. So that's where that led me, but thank you for that pathway of thought. I'll keep thinking about it.
Okay, thanks, Peter. It's a passionate question, but it's also a huge question for me. I think now I'm just thinking about Woolf use animal as a kind of form to rewrite the tradition of biography. And maybe it's also related to some issues like the modernity, because because we all know in the late period of the Victorian age, the industrialization got started, and those animals, especially for the stray dogs in the street, I think maybe they must be eliminated or get rid of. I'm not sure, but maybe I think it's a kind of possible direction for us to think about it further. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, really fascinating. We're almost running out of time. We've probably got time for one last quick question. If anyone has anything they're burning to ask. Okay. Maybe everyone's conserving their energy at this point in the conference, which is very wise. So I guess we will wrap things up here. If everyone could join me in thanking our panelists again for a really, wonderful kickoff to the conference. Thank you all.
Okay, I'm going to end the recording and close the meeting. Okay, thanks everybody. It was a great panel. Learned a lot. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you. I'm stopping the recording and I'm going to the meeting.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Peter, for chairing.
Thanks, everyone.